Welcome to the Tax Alpha Solutions Podcast, hosted by Matt Chansey. Matt is a tax consultant, author, and certified financial planner with almost 2 decades helping his clients grow their net worth. On the show, Matt brings together an array of specialists to share with you their experience and success along with strategies of the 1%. Matt Chansey is with Coastal One, member FINRA SIPC. And now, here's your host, Matt Chansey.
Good afternoon, everyone. How you doing today? Today's episode of our podcast, this is Matt Chansey with the Tax Alpha Podcast. And on today's podcast, we are interviewing Maria del Pilar, and she just goes by Pilar. And she is an attorney with the Rubio International Law Firm, specializing in international tax concerns for people that have a connection, obviously, to the United States, but internationally as well. Hi, Pilar. How you doing?
Hi, man. How are you? I'm doing excellent. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So tell me a little bit, I guess, about, let's just start with, obviously, you have some international ties. So let's talk about that. Like, what made you get into international tax law? Because I can't assume that would be something that's like is everybody's first like top of mind. Hey, you know what? I'm going to do international tax law. How did you pick that as a topic?
Okay, so I was born and raised in Colombia. I moved to the U.S. about 22 years ago, and I was going to law school, and I knew I wanted to do some transactional work. I didn't really know what kind of law I wanted to practice, but I knew I didn't want to do like criminal litigation, or I was more inclined towards like real estate planning. And then during law school, I had a conversation with a banker one time. I was asking for advice, and I said, look, what do you think? Do you think I should do the estate planning, LLM? Like, how do I, where do I go from here? And he said, look, if you really want to do something that not everybody's doing out there, and just do a master's in taxes. And I was like, okay, I'm pretty good at math. Most people that go to law school are not. So there I had an advantage. And I was like, okay, I can do that. So I enrolled into the master's LLM program at UM. And when I was, going there, taking my classes, I noticed that within tax, there's this, sub-specialization of international tax. And it was a very interesting topic. And I felt that I had the advantage of being able to connect with people from Latin America, especially because clearly like Spanish is my first language. So I was able to, communicate with them. I also went to law school in Colombia for 2 years. So, I had a basic knowledge of the legal framework and the legalese. And, I said, I think this is a good way for me to connect with, the Latin community, and also to be able to help them, right? Because I feel that a lot of foreigners, when they come to the US, even if they've been, educated in Europe or, the US, when they sit down to talk about their finances and their wealth, they really want to be able to talk in their own language and be explain everything, to the minimum detail. So that's how I landed in international tax.
Understand and agree with that statement very much. Actually, I've visited Central South America a great deal. Love Colombia. Was in Medellin a couple years ago for Festival of Flowers. I guess it was actually more than a couple years ago. It was right before COVID. So that was probably about 4 years ago now, but that was a great time. And
how was it?
It was.
Did you love it?
It was amazing, right? It was a great time. So I went with like 4 friends, and what we realized is look, I'm kind of a tallish, bigger, very white guy, right? And so I'm going to these things, I'm walking around, and you can see like these older ladies and these little kids like looking at me, and they're like, you could tell. And at first it didn't dawn on me, and then I kind of started catching on to it, and I was like, oh my God, some of these people probably never seen a big white guy like me before. Maybe I don't know, right? So when I realized they were looking at me like that, I would walk over and I would say, and I would look at them and I would go, me dá abraço. and everybody would just start laughing and just think that it was totally hysterical and totally funny. But anyway, it was a great time. It was totally a great time.
I'm happy to hear that.
But here's what's funny that you brought up. I've actually lived in Brazil before. And the reason that so my Portuguese is probably better than my Spanish, which it's still, neither one of them are very good, to be honest with you. But one of the reasons I left Brazil was because somebody brought to my attention that if I were driving a car and got pulled over by the government, that my Portuguese was, albeit very good conversationally, was not good enough to explain why I didn't have papers and all the other stuff for driving the car of a Brazilian citizen, right? And that was kind of scary. It was the first time I was like, oh my goodness, yeah, I would not be able to do a legal proceeding in Portuguese, right? So you brought that up, that yes, when a foreigner comes here, doesn't matter how good their English may or may not be, when they're talking about their legal and their finances, they want to talk about it in their native language. I agree with that.
Totally. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, that's awesome. So I've experienced that in my life, so I 100% agree with that. So you were an attorney that was good in math. You decided that taxes made a little sense because you were originally from Colombia. International tax law tend to make sense. And so now you've been doing this for a few years. I guess the next logical question would be, how do your customers find you, or how do you find them, the people that, because you're in South Florida, you're in the Miami area.
I am, yes, I'm in Coral Gables.
How do the people that you do business with, how do they know how to find you, that you are there for them to bridge that gap?
So to be honest with you, it's been quite surprising because up to this point, I haven't done much marketing, if any, and it's all by referrals. So and that goes to my point that I made at the beginning, where I do think that people, regardless of how wealthy they are or, how good their English is, they want to sit down with somebody that not only speaks their language, but also understands the culture and how things are done in Latin America, which is quite different from the US. So all of my clients are referrals from, previous or current clients, or maybe they're referred by professionals in Colombia or Peru or Mexico. Because, I don't only work with Colombians. Majority of my clients are Colombians, just again, because I think, they find that in common. But, most of them are referred by other professionals or clients.
Understood. Referrals, what I've always been told is referrals are the best business, right?
They are.
So what are some of the primary concerns for those of us that don't understand anything about tax law, right? Especially international tax law. What are some of the primary concerns that if someone were to hire an international tax lawyer, what type of problems are those people trying to solve?
Okay, so one of our major areas of practice is pre-immigration tax planning. And that's basically foreigners moving to the US who, have substantial wealth or assets, or, they have different sources of income abroad, and they want to move to the US and they want to know how to plan, to either transfer those assets to younger generations, or like how to handle those assets. Because once the person not only moves to the US, right, but becomes a tax resident in the US, then that person is going to be subject to US income taxes on their worldwide income. And they also have reporting obligations on their worldwide assets. And I found many times that people just move to the US, they're excited to come here, they apply for their green card, and they receive the green card, they're here with their family, they enroll the kids, at school. And then 6 months later, go to the tax attorney and they're like, oh, by the way, I've been here for 6 months and I have, these companies or these properties or, all of these assets abroad. What do I do? And then it's too late for them to plan ahead, right? To plan, because they already became tax residents of the US. That's something they have to do in advance to minimize the tax impact they're going to suffer when they come to the US. It's not about tax evasion or anything like that. It's just planning how to optimize your tax structure and how to reduce the reporting requirements too, because these foreign structures are subject to, huge amounts of reporting obligations.
Sure, sure. Understood. Yeah. And you brought up tax evasion, and I get asked questions like that all the time. Look, this stuff is legal. It's in the code. And I just tell people all the time, if your stuff is structured like this, titled like this, owned like this, reported like this, and the code says that you can structure it like this, and if you do so, you'll pay less in taxes, then all you have to ask yourself is, do I feel comfortable moving it from like this to like this? What do I have to learn? What do I have to understand? And what are the trade-offs to do that, right? So it's just learning how to play the game by the new set of rules that they now have to deal with, right?
Yeah, and also, even if, which, at the end is the goal usually to lower the tax impact. But even if that's not the case, because for some reason, they're going to end up paying the same taxes, they need to make sure that they comply with all the reporting obligations. Because if they don't, even if they pay all the taxes due, they could be subject to penalties and interest.
Sure.
So in the US, US taxpayers not only have the obligation to pay income tax or, state or gift tax, but they also have duties to report. And again, even if there's no tax due, or even if you pay all the taxes, if you don't comply with the reporting requirements, then you may be subject to substantial penalties.
Sure. You got to remain compliant, right? So, okay, I don't know the answer to this question. Let's use Colombia as an example. How similar or how different are the estate tax laws in a place like Colombia compared to the United States?
Completely different. I mean, that's the straight answer. They're totally different. And one of the mistakes that I see, a lot of taxpayers do is, as I said, they move to the US without planning in advance, number one. And number two, they arrive here and they just assume that the system works the same way it works in our countries, in Latin America or in Europe or whatever they come from. And they're just completely different.
Gotcha.
Right? I'm not a tax attorney, and actually I'm not an attorney in Colombia, but just to give you an example, in Colombia, the person or the subject that's subject to the estate tax, to the gift tax, is the person that receives the gift. In the US, the gift tax is imposed on the person that makes the gift.
That's right.
So that's just to give you an example that they're completely different.
Okay, it's kind of backwards there. Okay, yeah, from the way we do it here. Okay, but there still are gift tax thresholds, and there are estate tax thresholds where above those certain thresholds, you're going to be taxed.
To be honest with you, I'm not aware of any threshold in Colombia, I think, but don't quote me on this because again, I'm not an attorney in Colombia, but based on my experience, I don't think there's a threshold. I think every single inheritance is subject to like a 10% estate tax and 10% gift tax in Colombia, as opposed to the US, where you do have, an exemption. Currently is like over $12 million per person. And then any wealth that's transferred upon death, in excess of that amount is subject to a tax between 18 and 40%, depending on the amount of the state.
Sure. So client comes in, they're moving here from Colombia, they want to be a US citizen, they want to pay US taxes, they're doing the planning with you, and they're going to be subject to obviously estate taxes. They've got money or assets above those thresholds. What are some of the planning conversations that you get into with some of the clients? I'm not trying to give away your secret sauce, so I just want you to say high level, but what are the type of conversations that you have with a customer or with a client in those scenarios?
Well, one of the things some clients can do, and something I want to mention here, is that there's not a one size fits all in tax planning, right? It's not, because some people, for example, may, depending again on the age, right, of the taxpayer, the domicile of their children or grandchildren, the family and what's going on in the family, right? Are they going to disinherit somebody? Do they have a second or third spouse? Like, you have to look at all those factors. But one of the techniques that they may implement is they may transfer some of their wealth prior to becoming a US person to, their kids or grandkids. But again, it's very important to make sure that these clients also have a local advisor with them, right? Because I may give them, options that will work from the US perspective, but will be harmful from the foreign jurisdiction perspective. So we have to get together with the local advisor and make sure that we find a solution that works for both jurisdictions, right? Or at least has the least impact for them.
Sure. Everything has every strategy, and as many of them as there might be, have a pro and a con. There's some
Correct.
stuff that works in your favor, and there's some negative consequences to it. You just have to look at it and go, is the juice worth the squeeze? Is it more good than bad, right?
Exactly. And for example, and this goes to my point that there's not a one size fits all, right? Because you can advise somebody who's 40 years old to give away their wealth, as opposed to somebody that's 98 years old,
Sure.
right? Because somebody younger might not want to lose control of their assets or the enjoyment of the assets. Somebody that's older, that may be sick, there's other considerations. They may be more willing to transfer those assets to younger generations before they acquire, US domicile.
Well, absolutely. And families are all different, right? You can't just say, hey, transfer your assets to your kids. They might not have kids. They might not like their kids. Their kids could be alcoholics or drug addicts or partiers or something. And that would be the worst thing that you could do, is transfer those assets to those kids. So, some people have charitable intent. Is that is charitable intent is that something that you take into account when you're doing your planning?
Of course, so long as the client decides to do it, yes. There's people that do have that intent, there's people that don't. But you kind of like first sit down and get to know the client, their objectives, the family, what's going on. And then we make suggestions based on what, deems to be best for the clients.
Sure, absolutely understand. It's funny when you talk about charitable planning with clients, and you explain the benefits, potentially the tax benefits associated with charitable intent. It's funny, if you help educate somebody, you can take somebody with no charitable intent and create charitable intent because of the benefits associated with it, right?
Yes. Well, it depends. You really find, everything, and everyone is so different, right? I've had clients that I've said, look, we need to plan, this way or that way, because, for example, people who are not domiciliaries in the US and they own like real estate here. That's one of the biggest situations that I find. It's foreigners come to the US and they buy real estate on their personal name or through a Florida LLC, which is the same, right, for tax purposes as buying it on their own name.
Yep.
And then they come to me and they're like, oh, I invested in this $3 million property through an LLC because that's what the realtor told me. And I'm like, well, okay, let me explain this to you. You own a US asset for US estate tax purposes. So if you die with this asset on your name, or you being the sole member of this LLC that in turn owns the real estate, the first $60,000 of market value are going to be exempt from estate tax, but the rest is going to be subject to that 18 to 40% estate tax. That means that your estate tax liability could be about $800,000, $900,000. It depends, it depends whether they have a loan or they don't, but just to give you an example. And so if you plan, it might cost you, a few thousands of dollars, but you're going to minimize or, avoid that estate tax exposure. And sometimes I've had clients that say, well, my kids should be happy. I'm leaving them anything, so they will have to deal with the tax. I don't want to deal with it. It's like, okay, but, you're leaving these assets, like try to do it right. And some people they don't do it. Just, I don't know if it's because, I don't know, they're afraid of it. Maybe they don't know enough, or they honestly feel that, their kids should be grateful they're getting anything at all. So,
look, I don't know about you, but nobody ever left me anything, right? And so I think there's a lot of people out there that have done decently well for themselves, maybe, and nobody left them anything. And they're like, hey, if you're lucky enough for me to leave you something and it comes with a tax bill or some complexity, sort it out.
Totally.
So
totally.
Not the worst case scenario in the world, right?
Yeah.
But to your point, to the other side of that are the investors that have that have businesses, that have real estate, that they want to remain, though they want those assets to remain in their family and part of their legacy, and they don't want to have those assets sold or disassembled or whatever to ultimately pay a tax bill later. So that creates another level of complexity for that type of planning.
Right, right. And again, there's different solutions for every case, depending on the age of the person and whether they are insurable or not, which sometimes suggests that they just get life insurance. So in case they pass away, their family has the liquidity to pay the tax, or you're not avoiding the tax, but you are creating the liquidity. And it all depends on the person and their own situation.
Sure. So let's lean into that a little bit, because I'm not sure everybody's familiar with how that's used in that scenario. And so what we're talking about is we own assets, we own a business, we own real estate, and say, let's assume that our business or our real estate's worth $10 million. Let's just pick a number, right? If we die from an estate tax perspective, and that's included and counts against us, part of the value of that is going to have to be paid to the federal government in the form of taxes, right?
Well, again, it depends on the domicile of the person, right? So if the person is domiciled in the US, then they do have an exemption, which currently is 12.07 or less.
That's
so
right.
If you own assets worth $10 million and you are a US person, then there's no estate tax due, because you can have up to 12 point whatever free of estate tax.
That's right.
And now there are some reporting obligations, even if there is no tax due.
Sure.
In that scenario. Now, if you are a non-domiciliary of the United States, right, then, and you own the same $10 million of real estate in your personal name, let's say, then the first $60,000 are going to be exempt from US estate tax. And then the $9,940,000 are going to be subject to US estate tax in a rate that ranges from 18 to 40.
Why only 60,000 is exempt?
Because that's the exemption amount for non-domiciliaries.
Interesting. That's a really low amount in the grand scheme.
It's very low, very low. And do you have any idea how many foreigners are investing in real estate in South Florida now? I mean, I don't know. Like you mentioned that you mentioned that you live in Tampa and Orlando, and I'm sure Orlando is a very hot market too. But Miami is insane right now.
Yeah.
And it's not only Latin Americans; it's Europeans are trying to buy real estate here. Even people from the U.S. that move here from one other states.
Yeah.
So just any apartment nowadays in Miami is $1 million. That's not too high anymore. And then you have all these foreigners that come here. Again, they don't find the proper advice. They just go by what the realtors say, right? And I have nothing against realtors here, just to make sure. But sometimes they do advise in subjects that, they shouldn't be. And people just come create these LLCs, through zombies. And they go out and buy properties. And then they have a big problem.
Sure. Okay. So let's go back to that example, $10 million of real estate. They have $60,000 exempt. They're basically going to have to pay taxes on about $9.9 million worth of real estate, right? So in that scenario, if they know there's going to be a tax bill that becomes inevitable that they're going to have to pay, they either have to be willing to sell the asset to pay the tax bill. They have to have some other cash or other assets that could be converted to cash to ultimately pay the tax bill. Or what we started on that conversation was they buy a life insurance policy, potentially for the amount of taxes that they would project that they owe that are due. And that's just considered part of the expense of carrying the real estate, because now you've got a life insurance policy that the death benefits would show up if and when that person passes away. So they would have the liquidity to pay the tax bill and be able to keep the real estate.
Those are some of the options. Yeah. Another option is maybe transfer the property to like an irrevocable trust, that is not subject to in which the assets are not subject to US estate tax. But again, it depends how It just depends.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to give
Yeah,
away
but
all the secrets, and we're
no,
not
no,
trying
no,
to.
it's not about
Yeah,
that. It just, this is a general conversation. So yeah, they may transfer it to like an irrevocable trust.
yeah.
Some people try to transfer those assets to foreign corporations, right? Which is commonly done, but it's not really allowed by the code. In other words, it is allowed, but there are some rules that are called the inversion rules, pursuant to which if you transfer all of the assets or substantially all of the assets, to a foreign corporation of a domestic corporation to a foreign corporation, then that foreign corporation will be treated as a domestic corporation. And therefore, at the end, even if they own shares of a foreign corporation under certain circumstances, they may be treated as if that was a US corp. And therefore, the value of those shares will be also includable in the state. That's a little bit more complicated to explain. But basically, once they already own the asset under name, there are few options, but they're not as many options as they will have if they plan before they invest here.
So it would have been different had they have purchased the asset in the foreign corporation's name instead of purchasing it differently and then transferring it to the foreign corporation name.
Exactly.
That's good. That's good to know. That's a good little.
Exactly.
So because of the type of customers that you work with and your clients, how often are you having those potential citizenship conversations around some of the reinvestment programs like EB-5 at all? Is that anything that you're ever involved with?
So no, we do not practice immigration law. I do work, with some immigration attorneys, but most of my clients already come with immigration attorneys. But I do provide support for the immigration attorneys. Sometimes they need like business plans or they need financial data. They need, the clients to make a capital contribution. So I do assist on that portion of the transaction. But no, we don't give immigration advice.
Understood. I feel like those are related a little bit,
They
like,
are.
but yeah, so that's good that we drew a line in there and it's not
They are.
necessarily the same thing.
Yeah.
Very good. So every time legislatively, like, so for example, recently we had the passage, or they're working on passing the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA thing. So every time we hear one of these, legal bills that are trying to pass, how often is there something in there that affects the way that you can ultimately plan for clients so that it changes some of the strategies or some of the opportunities?
A lot of times. So, for example, last year, there was a bill that it actually didn't pass, but, there was a bill to reduce the exemption amount, the $12 million amount, which was increased by President Trump. And, if that exemption amount is reduced to, let's say, $3 million, $1 million, $5 million, like nobody knows, right, what's going to happen yet. But we do think that it's going to be substantially reduced. And if it is, then all of the taxpayers or all of our clients that have assets worth more than the exemption amount have to like sit down and revisit their tax planning.
That's right.
Because the assets that are now sheltered from estate tax under that exemption amount are going to probably be subject to estate tax if they lower that amount. So yeah, very often.
Because you could have a married couple today with about $24 million worth of stuff and not have estate tax concerns. But
correct. Because that 12.07, it's per person.
It's per person, right? So that's for a husband and a wife. So you get to add that together for a married couple.
Correct.
Right? Okay, correct. So you've got a married couple with almost $24 million worth of assets. And if they come in legislatively and change that to like $5 million per person, or a total of 10 million, those people now went from no tax on their 24 million to having $14 million of that exposed to taxes. That's a big difference, right?
It is, of course. And if the state amount is more or less $14 million, then it will probably be subject to the 40% estate tax rate, which is pretty high.
Yeah. Nobody likes giving away 40% of their stuff, right?
Exactly.
Understood. Do you have clients that are constantly, because I'm sure there are some clients that are educated enough to understand that those estate tax limits are discussed almost every time there's a bill being passed? Are they nervous? Are they scared about those things? Does it concern them?
Yes, yes. Some of the clients are very well educated on taxes, and they keep track of it. But again, because most of our clients are foreigners, they usually are not, right? And they usually do not understand. They come here and they're like, why do I have to pay these? In my country, I didn't have to pay that. And that's part of what I love about my job. And it's kind of like teaching people, right, how it works and how to navigate the system, because they come here, they move to the US, and people just have no idea how anything works, right? Not even to obtain a notary stamp. They have no idea how it works. So part of what I like the most about my job is like to sit down and to be able to explain to them how it works, and to educate them a little bit. So some of them, keep track of the laws, to go back to your question, but some of them like are totally lost.
Yeah, yeah. They're like, that's
Yeah.
why I'm hiring you, so you can take care of
Yeah,
it.
you keep track of it. Exactly. Exactly.
Or they want to cherry pick. They're like, can we just, that law is better back home. Can we use that rule as opposed to the
Oh
one?
my God. Yes, yes. I do have clients, I have a recent client that he was making a distribution, is from France, and he was making a distribution to France. And I said, look, let me look at the treaty, because usually dividends paid to foreign corporations, from US corporations to foreign corporations, are subject to a 30% withholding. He's like, no, what do you mean 30% withholding? This is a repatriation of assets free of tax under French law. And I was like, that's great. That's how it works under French law, not under US law. Let me teach you how it works. So yes, they do think that either they think that everything works, the way they're used to it, or they just try to cherry pick completely.
Sure. So you brought up tax treaties. Are there some countries that we have much more favorable tax treaties with, and then other countries where there's much less favorable tax treaties to work with?
Yeah, every single tax treaty is different, but I will say the main difference is not only between terms of different tax treaties, even though they are all different. I think the biggest difference comes when there are tax treaties versus jurisdictions that do not have tax treaties, right? So for example, in Latin America, only Mexico and Venezuela have US income tax treaty with the US.
Okay,
Not,
interesting.
all the other countries do not. So yeah, when you do tax planning, or a tax analysis for somebody that comes from Argentina or Peru or Colombia or Venezuela versus somebody from Mexico, the impact is completely different.
So, okay, this is an area I certainly don't know enough about. So why don't we have tax treaties with those other countries? It's not like their citizens aren't also trying to come here. Like, what causes a tax treaty to happen between some countries and not happen between other countries?
I think that's a very complicated question. I assume there are different interests, with different countries. I mean, and for example, there's a tax treaty with Chile that I may be wrong on the number of years, but I think it has been like, they're been having conversations about implementing this treaty for like over 20 years. So I think there's a lot of bureaucracy. And I imagine the answer is bureaucracy and different interests with different countries.
You mean politicians getting in the way of things, slowing it down a little bit? Is that what you're talking about? Maybe. Understood. So what are some of the most common misconceptions that when somebody comes to see you, what do customers tend to think or believe that tends to be wrong when they come to visit you?
As I said before, a lot of things, they do think that, the things in the US work same as in their countries. One of the scenarios that I find very often are US citizens that were born here when their parents were going to school, or when their parents were on vacations, and, right after that, they moved to their country. They've been there for 45 years. They've gone to school there, they work there, they have never been in the US besides when they were born, or they went to Disney World 5 days in 2000. and they realize that they are subject to taxes in the US, even if they have not lived a single day in the US, even if they have not earned a single dollar from US source, even if they have no connections with the US whatsoever, besides having that passport. And clients, they just freak out. And, their question is, okay, I get it. I was born in the US, 53 years ago, but I never went back to the US. Why am I obligated to file income tax returns in the US and pay taxes there for the income and assets that I own in my own country? And then you gotta sit down and be like, that's how it works, and because you are a US person, you are subject to this worldwide tax system. And then the next question is, okay, I'm going to give up my passport. And my answer is, well, we have to analyze that, because if you, expatriate, then there's going to be like an exit tax. And, to give you just a general idea, the way it works is as if the taxpayer has sold all of their assets worldwide the day before giving up their passport, then they have to pay the gain on all of those assets. So it's expensive.
Wow, that's complicated. So
Yes.
somebody that's never been here, really, that has citizenship for those reasons that you outlined, could owe tons of income tax that they've never paid to the United States. And when they realize that and say, I want to just walk away from this whole US deal, there could be another tax that could potentially be worse than the income tax.
Correct. Exactly.
Oh, that doesn't sound like a fun conversation to have.
No, it does not. And it surprised a lot of people, because honestly, like I do have clients that, or I've had conversations with people that they're like, look, I was born there when my parents were going to med school and I never went back to the US. Like, what is this? And yeah, that's how it works. So another one of the things that we do, or the services that we offer, is we assist taxpayer in becoming compliant when they're not compliant, right? There are some programs that the IRS offers and allows taxpayers to like voluntarily come to the IRS and disclose their assets and their income and certain things that need to be disclosed. And usually by paying either some part of the tax due or interest or penalties depending on the situation and the amount of income, assets unreported, then they can become compliant with their tax obligation.
Oh, I'm sure that's kind of a weight off their shoulders, that there's a program or a workout, knowing that, because I imagine there's a lot of people that, way more than we realize, that fall into that little bucket of potential clients. So that's great that there's a workout program for that instead of just this big gotcha.
Yeah, exactly. Now, as a general rule, they can only participate in those programs before the IRS actually finds out about them. In other words, they cannot be under a civil or criminal investigation by the IRS to be able to participate in those programs.
Gotcha. So it's voluntary. Like, you're like, as soon as you find out, you have to self-report, hey, I made a mistake. I just found out it was a mistake. I'm ready to come clean. Show me mercy.
Exactly. If you wait for the IRS to come and knock on your door, then you are in a whole different situation.
It's too late.
Yes, too late. Same as those taxpayers that come to the US, right? As I said at the beginning, and 6 months later, like, okay, I've been living here for 6 months. It's like, it's too late now.
Right. Yeah, well, planning with anything and being, because we all learn. It's unfortunate sometimes that there are some really harsh penalties for not knowing how to make the right decision. So, at that point, I think the rules are, yes, this is complex and maybe everybody doesn't know it, but as long as you were showing good faith and you tried to follow the rules, they're like, okay, they were trying. They weren't trying to bend them or break them.
Yeah, exactly.
So
exactly.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, hey, Pilar, this has been a great conversation, and we're kind of running a little bit short on our time today. Any final thoughts, something that I should have asked, something I didn't ask? What does the audience need to know about international tax law, other than my big takeaway is if you realize you're caught in a tough spot with international tax law, go tell somebody about it sooner than later and beg for mercy, right?
Yeah, and I think my last comment will be, you don't know what you don't know until you find out what you don't know. So, if you are not, or even if you are from the US and you're thinking of moving to the US, if you're thinking about, investing in the US, opening a business here, just go and, and get somebody to help you walk through that.
Understood.
Don't just try to do it on your own without knowing what you're doing. Just go and get legal and proper advice before you do that.
Well, now that begs the question, how many people come to you after attempting to be their own attorney and do some of their own legal and tax work?
Oh my God, so many.
Really?
So many. And I don't know if this happens in Tampa and Orlando, in the area or not, but here in Miami, everybody seems to know about immigration, taxes, real estate. So they always come and it's no, but the friend of my cousin, they told me that I needed to do this and that. And it's oh God, why do you go ask, somebody that works in, I don't know, it's a TV producer about taxes? Just go to the right professionals. If you need to find out about real estate, then go talk to a real estate expert. If you need to know about taxes, talk to a tax expert. Don't just listen advice, from anyone and everywhere, and people who don't really have the right information.
Yeah, well, that will never change. There are always people out there that when they get a hold of a little bit of free information that sounds a little better than what they think that they know, right? They're like, hey, and I'm like, but what did you pay for that? Nothing, right? So how much value can you expect that to have in the grand scheme of things, right? Zero.
Yeah. So, yeah. Just go get the proper advice.
Go find how to hire the right person and ask the right questions. So
right.
Many times, look, and I'll let you speak to this. How many times have people come in for purely maybe just a consultation at the beginning of a conversation, and you realize we're able to help a bunch of their fears and their anxiety in the consultation? You're like, hey, it's not nearly as bad as you think, and and they didn't know that. And now you're able to give them that peace of mind, right?
Yes, totally. Yes.
So yeah, hire the right person, get the good advice, and then make an informed decision, right?
Exactly. If not, it's going to be more expensive. At the end, you're going to end up paying more if you don't get the proper advice.
Absolutely. It always costs more to clean up the mess, right?
Totally.
Understood. Well, Pilar, thanks so much for coming on today. Today we had international tax attorney Pilar Rubio on us from Rubio International Tax Law. Thanks for everybody for listening and tuning in with us today. We appreciate it. This was Matt Chancey and the Tax Alpha Podcast. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Tax Alpha Solutions, brought to you by Matt Chancey. We hope you enjoyed listening to this week's guests and insight. If you liked what you heard, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts.